November 5th, 2024. This page in my diary will probably testify to one of my most important discoveries. I have always been interested in history and the mysteries of the past. Since I can remember, I've always dreamed of being among decrepit artifacts. Digging is a kind of connection with the past. But today in Girsu, standing at the door of a temple that the Sumerians consider sacred, I felt again how strong this bond is. I'm Mark Reynolds. He is a 42-year-old British archaeologist. I have spent most of my life in the excavation areas. I've witnessed many discoveries during this time, but this place is different. We think we have found the lost temple of the Sumerians in Anu. We have been working here for 6 months together with our excavation team. This is a place that makes one feel both admiration and a strange uneasiness. Being in the middle of the desert, among the ruins of a civilization thousands of years old, you realize how quickly time passes decently. The story of the temple is fascinating. Eninu, known as the White Lightning Bird, is a temple dedicated to Ningirsu, the Sumerian god of war. We know his name from Sumerian texts and inscriptions on the statue of King Gudea. In Sumerian mythology, this temple is depicted as a gateway between the world of gods and the world of people. December. A structure as mysterious as it is sacred. Today we finally found the entrance and started examining the inscriptions on the stone door. There are 4 other people in the team: Dr. Elena Moritz, the leader of our archaeological team. Elena is an expert on ancient languages and Sumerian civilization. In addition, our team's local guide and archaeologist, Samir Haddad, translates most of the texts in the Sumerian language. Lisa Carter, geologist, is interested in the age and structure of the stones. Finally, we have our young intern, Tom Grant. Tom is very energetic, maybe a little too much, but he is hungry to learn. Everyone has their own unique role in this excavation. When we arrived at the gate, most of the inscriptions had been destroyed, but we can still read some of them. Samir said that the signs on the stones contain some kind of warning. Some of the writings contain phrases such as sacred space and protected area. Elena noted that such expressions are common among the Sumerians and are often seen in religious buildings. However, Samir paused at one point. He said he could not quite translate a phrase that had passed in one of the inscriptions. It was something like "the white lightning bird sleeps here." Obviously, this once again shows the size and importance of the temple. The Sumerian people saw this place not only as a temple, but also as a kind of divine shelter. We continue to work around the door throughout the day. The stone door is huge. It is about 4 meters high and 2 meters wide. It looks like it will be quite difficult to open. Lisa noted that the stones on top of the door collapsed over time, compressing the door even more. But as a team, we are used to such difficulties. We've been working for this place for months and we won't give up. There is an interesting silence in the excavation camp at night. The desert is cold, and the sound of the winds is strange enough to occupy one's mind. But tonight the camp has a different atmosphere. Everyone is silent, perhaps from fatigue or the excitement of discovery. While writing my diary, I can't help thinking about what's behind the door on the one hand. A temple that the Sumerians attach such importance to, perhaps it is hiding something that we have never seen until today. I don't know what we'll encounter when we get inside, but this discovery will be something that will be etched in history. We'll try to open the door tomorrow. This could be one of the biggest steps not only of the excavation, but also of my career. But I have to admit, I have a strange feeling. Maybe it's just excitement. Still, I can't get rid of the feeling that something is watching us here. It's just a temple, isn't it? November 6th, 2024. Everything I thought last night came back to life in my mind as soon as I stood in front of the huge stone door of the temple this morning. The team looks quite energetic, but the tension in their eyes was also obvious. In fact, although this may seem like an ordinary working day for an archaeologist, there was an atmosphere that made us all shiver. Today was the time to open the door. And this was not only a historic moment, but also a step into the unknown. We started work early in the morning. The equipment used to open the door was meticulously placed. We had to be cautious every step of the way, as Lisa said there was a risk that the stones on the door would collapse. There were deep hollows on both sides of the door. We thought that these cavities were part of the mechanism that moved the door. Elena noted that the door may have been made with Sumerian engineering. It is fascinating to know that the Sumerians could have built such a complex system thousands of years ago. The team worked for hours. We were trying to move the stone door with picks, crowbars, and modern machines. The door was obstinate, as if it had resisted movement because it had stood here for centuries. But at last, later in the day, it was dislodged somewhat by a heavy noise. A thin cloud of dust spread out from under the door, and at this time, a slight but disturbing smell from inside attracted my attention. It was difficult to understand the source of the smell. It could have been some kind of dampness or the smell of 1,000-year-old air. Still, we weren't in a position to care about it at that moment. The interior of the temple was finally beginning to show its face to us. With the opening of the door, we used the powerful flashlights we had. The darkness inside literally seemed like a void. As we watched the light dance on the walls, the first thing we saw were the heavily embroidered stone decorations. The walls were covered with scenes related to Sumerian mythology. A depiction of Ningersu surrounded by storm clouds made the sanctity of the temple felt at the very first moment. Each scene was rendered in incredible detail, and some of them were like keys for us to understand the Sumerians' connection with the gods. Elena immediately began to study the wall lettering. According to the translation, the inscriptions seemed to be some kind of ritual instruction. But some sections were worn out, which made it difficult for us to understand the entire article. Samir was carefully examining the symbols on the walls and said that he had seen some of them for the first time. These symbols were similar to the known Sumerian writings, but not exactly the same. There was silence inside for a while. Everyone was focused on their own business, but the silence was broken only by a sentence from Samir, who said, half amazed, "There's something here." When we asked what Samir meant, he pointed to a figure on the walls. The figure was different from the others. The eyes of this figure, which resembled a large bird, seemed to be made of a red-colored stone. The writing around the figure began, according to the translation, "the one who should not be awakened," but then the text was completely deleted. Elena said that this is just a mythological narrative and pointed out that we should not care. But Samir was questioning why such a warning was included in such a large temple. His reaction also made me think for a moment. Throughout history, many civilizations have resorted to mythological narratives to protect their sacred places. The Sumerians probably should have done the same thing. As we moved inside, we noticed how big the temple was. A long corridor seemed to lead us deeper, but there was no light source of any kind on the walls or anything except carvings. At the end of the corridor, we reached a large room. The room was literally in the shape of a gigantic dome. There was an interesting pattern on the ceiling. It resembled a kind of star map. Lisa said it could be a temple connected to astronomy. We knew that the Sumerians had information about the stars, but this was the first time we had seen such a detailed map. There was a big stone table in the middle of the room. The table was also covered with inscriptions. However, these inscriptions looked much different than the inscriptions on the door. It was more complicated and vague. When Samir examined the writings, he said that this was a departure from the standard writing system of the Sumerians and may indicate an older language. For a moment, the excitement on everyone's faces was replaced by surprise. Could we have found traces of a civilization that lived earlier than the Sumerians in such an ancient temple? Lisa took several samples to determine the age of the stones around the table. But the answer to this question was not likely to be answered that day. As we continued to work, we could not realize how time had passed. The sun had already set, and the cold night of the desert was beginning to make itself felt. When we got back to the excavation site, everyone was tired, but there was a strange silence. It was as if the temple had opened only a small door for us and was hiding a bigger secret behind it. It was like a puzzle, not just an excavation. But that night, When I returned to the campsite, there was a strange restlessness inside me. Everything I saw in the temple seemed to be engraved on my mind. Those inscriptions, that red stone-eyed figure, that star map, it was like something was watching us. I decided to make a few more notes in my diary before going to bed. Tomorrow we will try to go deeper into the temple. But on the one hand, I think about that warning on the door, not to be woken up. This may just be a myth, but something tells me that there is much more to it. November 7th, 2024. Early in the morning, the team was ready to step inside the temple again. But after our discoveries yesterday, I noticed that no one was impatient or excited. The silence in the campsite reflected the growing unease within everyone. Lisa reminded us at the morning meeting that we need to be careful in the temple, especially to take care of the places we shouldn't touch. But how useful could these warnings have been? The meaning behind the inscriptions we saw yesterday was still a mystery. We started to move deeper into the temple. There were very few inscriptions on the walls now. They had been replaced by various symbols and strange shapes. The curved patterns resembled a maze just like that. It was like a road map that led us, but we didn't know where it was leading us. Unlike the red stone-eyed figure we first saw, these symbols were more abstract and incomprehensible. As we walked along the corridor, the cold and humid air was penetrating our skin. Each step was lost in the darkness with an echoing sound. After a while, the narrow corridor led us to another room. This room was much smaller and closed than the previous ones. The ceiling was so low that we had to walk leaning over. There seemed to be nothing inside, but when we looked carefully, we noticed some kind of carvings on the floor. The fine lines etched on the stones resembled the roots of a tree. However, Samir said that this is a kind of map. The dot in the center of the carvings seemed to indicate the large room. Lisa and Elena thought that this map might be connected to a real underground system. However, Samir insisted that the map had a ritual or symbolic meaning rather than showing a realistic path. Just as we were discussing the map, a sound from the hallway startled us all. At first, we thought it was the sound of a stone falling, but the duration and tone of the echo were strange. It was as if someone's footsteps were slowly approaching us. Elena tried to calm us down by saying that it was just the effect of the wind. But we all felt the same thing. We weren't alone. After a short break, Samir decided to make his way to the end of the corridor. Reluctantly, we followed him. The corridor led us to another large room. However, this room was very different from the first one we saw. The walls were blackened, the stones looked almost like coal. It was as if this area had been burned down or subjected to a large explosion. In the center of the room, there was a round platform. There was a statue on the platform, similar to the red stone-eyed figure we had seen before, but much larger. However, this statue resembled a human being. The facial features were quite sharp and clear. He was holding a large bowl in his hands, but the bowl was hollow. Samir said that this figure may represent a god in Sumerian mythology. However, Lisa noted that such a figure has not been found in the Sumerian records. It was at this moment that Elena noticed the inscriptions on the bowl. The lettering was similar to the warning on the door yesterday, but there was a longer text here. Samir immediately started reading. His silence is our shield that protects us. But he bears the burden of the one who disturbs him, who breaks the silence, who is exiled from this world. These words gave everyone goosebumps. Lisa tried to repeat that this was just a mythological narrative, but the look on Samir's face made it clear that he thought the posts were not just a warning. While I was looking at the bowl, I noticed something. At the bottom of the bowl, there was a small hollow. When we shone a light into it, traces of some kind of liquid could be seen. As we examined the surroundings more carefully, some of the carvings on the floor gradually began to make sense. It was clear that there was some kind of ritual performed in the center of this room. But what was the purpose of this ritual? Was there a sacrifice being made, or was there some kind of blessing being performed? Lisa argued that this was purely about a religious rite, but Elena said that such a scary figure could not just be an object of worship. Just at that moment, we heard a voice from one of the dark corners of the room. This was different from the sounds of hitting a stone that we had heard before. It sounded like a deep and rhythmic murmur. We all pointed our lanterns in that direction, but we couldn't see anything. The murmuring ceased after a while, but our hearts seemed to be dislocated now. Lisa said that this is just an echo and is due to the ancient structure of the temple. But it was not enough to calm the fear in us. We decided to go back. But on the way back, the corridors no longer looked as familiar as they used to. It was as if the temple had changed its ways. Everyone was starting to panic. Samir tried to re-examine the map, but the markings on it no longer made sense. Lisa said we should stay calm, but we all knew that this temple was not just a historical monument. There was something inside, and that thing wasn't forcing us to get out. We finally managed to get back to the first big room. However, when we arrived here, the stone door of the temple was not half open as it was when we arrived. The door was completely closed. There was no light coming from outside, and the air inside had become heavier. Elena tried to look for a way out, but we couldn't find anything. The darkness was settling down on us like it was no longer just a fear, but also a physical reality. And at that moment, a voice rose from the platform in the center of the room. A deep, lush, and incomprehensible murmur. We all froze. That murmur seemed to herald the breaking of thousands of years of silence.
On a cold morning in March 2024, our team excavating in Inner Mongolia had set off from a village just a few kilometers away, drinking their breakfast in the morning. When I stepped into the excavation area, no matter how extraordinary everything I saw with my own eyes was, I had been in this business for years, and every new find made me even more excited. My name is Lu Wei, and as an archaeologist, I have been conducting various excavations in the northern regions of China for 20 years. But this expedition in Inner Mongolia was to be one of the most important events in my career. My teammates and I have collected various findings related to the ongoing excavations in this region over the years, but we have not been able to figure out exactly where we should focus. The area where the excavation was to be carried out was traditionally located around a mound that the local people considered sacred. For centuries, the residents here have been telling us that something is hidden about the ancient belief system of the region. Sometimes, ancient legends were told. It was said that there were hidden treasures in the soil. All these have turned into questions that have been bothering me since the first day archaeological studies started. But this time things were different. This excavation did not start like an ordinary excavation. In the first days we did not find anything obvious. However, as the excavations progressed, some figures made of old stones, different symbols, and several fragmented pieces of sculpture began to appear under the ground. These were stone sculptures made with highly detailed workmanship, each of which looked like it belonged to an ancient culture. Each piece represented a very valuable historical heritage, but my team and I started asking the same question all the time: who did these belong to? And why has such an important culture disappeared? One morning, another item that we pulled out of the depths of the soil changed the course of everything. My teammate Han had found something in a slightly further corner of the excavation site. When I ran to him, he had a very different object in his hand. We were sure that it was a figure, a dragon made of soft jade stone. The details on it were processed extremely carefully. For many years, it was rumored that such figures existed in the area, but such a large and majestic dragon figure was something that no one had ever seen before. Lu Wei. It's not just a statue. It's a message, he said. I felt the tremor in his voice. At first, I thought it might just be a stone figure. But he looked so special and impressive that I began to feel that something was going wrong. Yes, I had done countless studies on ancient cultures over the years, but this figure represented much more than others. The workmanship on it was almost making an association. When the other stones and figures in the excavation area were examined more carefully, it was noticed that there were other strange figures around this dragon. These were stones embroidered with different shapes and symbols. It was as if they were describing some kind of cosmological order, but we couldn't figure out what they meant. It's like some kind of code. Maybe it was part of a ritual, or it was much more. These were not ordinary stones. Something was buried deeper. Slowly but surely, every figure that came out of the excavation began to become even more important to us. Each of them seemed to carry the lost traces of a lost culture. On the way back to the excavation site, I could hear people's voices. But the restlessness in me was increasing more and more. I was feeling something, but I couldn't find enough clues to figure out what it was. This quiet, abandoned village in Inner Mongolia has taken on a different appearance now. Everything was going to change, but we didn't know what this change would lead to. The secret under the veil would reveal a much darker truth. After a week, I began to notice a change in the behavior of the excavation team members. At the beginning, everyone was quite enthusiastic and cheerful, but now the expressions on the faces were different. Before starting work in the morning, some of them were spending the night with a kind of restlessness. Although no one expressed it openly, there was a vague fear. People were taking breaks when they had the opportunity not to spend any more time at the excavation site. December. For me, it was the beginning of everything. Other stones that we found around the dragon figure, when we examined it very carefully, indicated some kind of ritualistic order. The symbols that were clearly visible between the figures indicated a decrepit belief system. There was no exact information about where these figures were placed, where they came from and what meaning they carried. But I had a feeling these were not ordinary figures. Slowly, as I started to dig deeper and deeper archaeologically, I noticed that things were starting to get strange. One morning at the excavation site, Hun said he discovered something very different on his own. When I found him, he was bent over on the ground and digging around a large stone with his hands. "Blue Wei, you should see this," he said. There was still an uneasiness in his voice. Looking around, I carefully approached to see what he had found. At that moment, there was another figure on the stone. This figure was different from the dragon we had found earlier. He looked like a human, but his face did not resemble a human in any way. His eyes looked like a blank, his feathers, teeth, everything was unusual. The size of the figure looked like a human figure, but definitely not a human. There was only a large, indistinct torso and a grotesque face depicting a mood. There were also symbols on the stone, which were embroidered with a different pattern from the previous figures. It was a kind of article, but no one could read this article. He was both old and foreign. That was when everything started to get weird. Dr. Xian was one of the most experienced members of the team, and when he saw this discovery that morning, a deep concern appeared on his face. "What are these?" he said. The uneasiness in his voice was increasing every moment. "These are not just stones, they can be a kind of call. Maybe there's something that needs to be done here." For me, too, everything has moved to another dimension at this point. Now this had ceased to be just an ordinary archaeological excavation. We didn't know what it was, but one thing was for sure, these figures had a meaning, and that meaning would somehow draw us in. That night, in the immediate vicinity of the excavation site, another team member, Jiao, said he experienced a strange incident. While walking in the darkness of the night, right near the excavation site, he had felt something moving. For a moment, he said, he felt someone behind him, but when he turned around, he didn't see anyone. There was fear in Jia's eyes, but he was so calm that he was still struggling not to express his fear. After that night, the decrepitude among the remaining members of the team gradually increased. The events had begun to create an atmosphere full of tension. As more figures came out to the excavation site every day, we started to see more signs of the inner side of the work over time. We thought that these stone figures were not just items belonging to an ancient culture. In fact, perhaps they had a much different purpose. The next day, in the afternoon, another strange thing happened during the excavation. When we pulled a figure out of the depths of the soil, we saw a blackened mark on the surface of the stone, like some kind of ink. This was spreading from the inside of the stone to the outside, and it was quite scary. There was some kind of symbol, but it was quite challenging to figure it out. The atmosphere at the excavation site was changing rapidly. The feeling that everything made sense was getting stronger and stronger. And after a while, we believed that these figures and stones carried a secret so deep that it led us to question everything we knew about ancient cultures and history. One morning, we noticed that one of the team members was missing. This was the first loss we experienced during the excavation. Jia left the excavation site to return for lunch, but he never came back after that day. He disappeared without a trace. And strangely enough, we learned that the missing person was last seen deep in the excavation area, in the area where those strange figures were found. Everyone at the excavation site was worried about his missing friend, but solving what was behind this disappearance took on a much different dimension. It was as if it wasn't just a person who disappeared, it was part of everything we discovered during the excavation. That missing person had, in some mysterious way, become a part of this old secret. After that lost day, the weather at the excavation site had completely changed. The whole thing had turned into a nightmare. Jia's disappearance had buried the hearts of the team in a deep fear and uncertainty. No one could understand what had happened. The fact that he was last seen in the area where the figures were located made me feel that there was something else involved in this business. There was a silence inside the excavation site. No one dared to look at each other directly. Everyone was hiding the fear inside themselves. And there was a deep discomfort inside me. The thought that the stone figures we discovered at the excavation site could be connected to Jia's disappearance is starting to make me very uneasy. December. The wind of fear was beginning to blow fast. I began to question whether it was right for us to deepen the excavation further. But on the other hand, I felt inside me that a secret had to be revealed. It was impossible to retreat, to take a step back. Everything had to mean something. I decided to leave the excavation site. I tried to convince my teammates to make the same decision, but each of them was aware of how scary the strange atmosphere we were in was. Everyone was confused. No one knew what to do. I was the only one who felt that there was something more. Each figure, each stone, was a key, and I had to solve these keys. It was like retreating now, disappearing in the darkness. One night, I was awakened by a strange sound coming from deep inside the excavation area. I can't explain it, but it was like something was moving. The stones were sliding, the ground was groaning, and it was like a kind of call. Pushing myself, I prepared to go towards the excavation site. My teammates were worried, but I thought I should go alone tonight. Maybe the answer to everything we haven't heard since Jia disappeared was there. When I went deeper into the excavation area, there had been a change in the locations of the stone figures. Some of the figures had been moved, no one had moved them. I focused my eyes, a strange beam of light was shining around the figures. The stones were placed in a different order than they had once been. It seemed like some kind of ritual. I noticed that the pattern formed by the stones around me coming together had become a kind of symbol. December. At that moment, I thought that there was a meaning to Jia's disappearance. Maybe Jia had done something wrong while walking around the figures. Perhaps the displacement of these stones was a warning of something that we should not interfere with. Suddenly, one of the stones in front of me slipped. It rolled with a loud noise, and another sound was heard coming from the depths. At that moment, everything went dark. A kind of humming was echoing like a deep scream. I stepped back in panic, but something froze me in my place. A figure was emerging from among the stones. December. Seeing this has caused all my common sense to disappear. A being that I could not imagine was coming to me with my eyes. In human form, but it was something else. He didn't look human. He had no head, no mouth, just a blank face. There were strange marks on his hands, and there was a vibration in his whole body that made his existence feel like a nightmare. I moved forward slowly, as if with a kind of partial awareness. At that very moment, I realized that something was wrong. Was it the power around the figures that called me? What was the meaning of Jia's disappearance? Was this all the play of some kind of being who came to find me at that point? Taking a deep breath, I took a step towards the figure. At that moment, a strange inscription appeared on one of the stones. According to legend, the writings engraved into the figure of a stone would trigger an awakening. I knew how far away my teammates with me were, but I had to get help somehow. These lost things had to be explained, this fear had to end. I took one last step. The figure suddenly started to move. One of the stones slid out of place and stopped next to the figure opposite me. And then everything went quiet. That frightening presence had disappeared. The excavation site had become calm again. After the excavation, everything was packed up in a very short time. I tried to explain that night, but no one really understood. No one was talking about the place where Jia disappeared anymore. Everyone was acting like they'd forgotten. The excavation has ended and there is only one thing left, the secret of those figures. No one knows what happened. What was that entity? The stones at the excavation site are still standing. Maybe someone will solve the secret they carry one day again. But after that night, will never forget that I had a connection